thieves or murderers face in a game theoretical context. Okay? And we'll find that if each of those two players are rational, then they will be unable to cooperate because there is a dominant strategy for each of them, and that dominant strategy takes them away from the mutually beneficial outcome. Just like in the case of T-Mobile and Horizon, there was a mutual outcome, namely collusion, but once you get to that outcome, there's an incentive for each of them to defect. Okay, a couple of concepts. Nash equilibrium. Have you all seen The Beautiful Mind? Okay, this is John Nash, who developed this particular concept before he had some difficulties with regard to psychological difficulties. And moreover, ultimately, many years later, he won a Nobel Prize in economics for this and related concepts. Okay? And here, the fundamental point about this equilibrium is that each firm or each player chooses its best strategy, given the strategies that all others have selected. Okay? And in our duopoly example, that Nash equilibrium is where each firm produces a quantity of 40. Okay? And we've already discovered, for that simple, straightforward example, what the Nash equilibrium is. Okay? And note here, all I've recognized that given that T-Mobile produces 40, Horizon's best move is to produce 40, and that is the basis for the Nash equilibrium. Okay, comparison of market outcomes. When the firms, each firm in an oligopoly individually chooses whatever production they're going to select to maximize profits, the output that's going to be generated is larger than the output that would have been selected by a pure monopolist. We've already seen that in our simple example, right? But it will be smaller than the competitive quantity that would move through the market if there was no strategic interactions between the firms and they were all price takers. As a result, the oligopolistic price is greater than the competitive price, but less than the monopoly price. Okay, so you have an ordering among these different structures with regard to the quantity that's going to be moving through the market in equilibrium and the price that's going to emerge in equilibrium. Okay? As we discussed in the last lecture, once again, the trade-off between output and price effects becomes critical. Because as in the case of a pure monopolist, the oligopolist also knows that the market demand curve that he or she faces is downward sloping. Okay? Just like the monopolist does. So there's an output effect, and just looking at the output effect, each firm is going to recognize so long as price is above marginal cost, by increasing output, they will raise their profits, right? But the trade-off is that there's also a price effect, because as they increase output and you've got a downward sloping demand curve, that can only take place if prices are lower for the incremental output. And if they're lower for some increase in output, you're going to get a lower price for everything you're selling, right? Certainly, oligopolists can't perfectly discriminate. Okay? So if you offer some additional quantity, you're going to face a lower price, not only for that incremental quantity, but all quantities that you're selling in that particular marketplace. So you've got the trade-off between the output and the price effect. And as we discussed in the last lecture, that trade-off is going to depend critically on the responsiveness of buyers in that market, whether demand is inelastic, elastic, and what the structure is of that responsiveness. Okay? All right. Now, if the output effect dominates over the price effect, then it's in the firm's interest to increase production, the oligopolistic firm. In contrast, if the price effect dominates, then it's going to be in the interest of the firm to reduce production. Right? So, the size of an oligopoly. As the number of firms in the market increases, we would expect us to move from a Nash equilibrium oligopolistic output structure toward the competitive structure. The price effect will become smaller, and the oligopolistic industry will look more and more like a competitive marketplace. And we would expect price to move in the direction of marginal cost. And we know when price is equal to marginal cost, there are no opportunities for generating incremental surplus, right? And total surplus in the market is our measure of economic efficiency, and as a result, we would expect under those circumstances a more nearly socially efficient marketplace. Now, another benefit from international trade. If you look today at the public discourse and the dysfunctionality between the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the executive branch, the one thing that they seem to agree upon is signing free trade agreements with various countries throughout the world. Why? What we've just provided you in the discussion that we've had about oligopolistic structures, if you have only two firms, for example, in a particular domestic economy, let me simplify just a bit. Here in the United States, there's two major automobile companies, right? General Motors and Ford. Now, if there were trade restrictions and the Germans couldn't sell BMWs and Mercedes in this country, or the Japanese could not sell Hondas and Toyotas, right? Then you would have a two-firm duopoly. But if you have free trade and you let those other two manufacturers come in, you've got a marketplace here within the United States where there's 6 automobile companies competing with one another. So you would expect with 6 a movement of prices toward marginal cost and declining prices, right? So it's going to increase total surplus vis-a-vis just allowing the two firms to hold on to the domestic market. Okay, let's take a concrete example with regard to the prisoner's dilemma. And Jimmy, I'm going to ask you to volunteer and leave the room for a few moments. But before I do, I want to explain that, Jimmy, you can smile, Chanel. You're going to be the other one part of this. You two are going to play the roles of Bonnie and Clyde. You're not going to be Bonnie, Jim. You're going to be Clyde. Okay. And you've been robbing banks all over the country, all right? Leave for a few moments. And you've now been apprehended, and you're both located in jail, and I put you in another room, okay? Okay, here's the story. I know that you've been robbing banks all over the country. You can't trust him. I know he's led you into this. You had no interest in this, and not only that, you're not married to him. You don't have a permanent relationship. Let it go and confess that you've robbed all these banks. If you confess, you get off scot-free, and he'll get 20 years in prison. If you choose not to confess, however, and he does confess, you'll end up with 20 years in prison. Right? Now, I would appreciate you coming forward and telling us that you did, in fact, jointly with Clyde, rob all those banks. Are you going to help her? No, this is just... Wait till she answers. No. You're going to confess? You're going to confess? Okay, fair enough. So we got that. What's the question? Yeah, but why should I tell her that when I'm negotiating with her? Why should I tell her that? You're quite right, but why should I tell her that? No, she doesn't. No, when I got them in two separate rooms, I'm not going to get them perfect. Can you leave us for a moment, go out this way, and we'll get Jimmy back up and see what he's going to do, whether he's going to sacrifice you as well? Hey, Jimmy, where are you? Come on. You guys sit down. Sure. So here's the story. We've been monitoring your movements for the last 5 or 6 years. We know that you've been robbing banks throughout the Midwest. And I want you to confess. If you confess, and it turns out that Bonnie doesn't confess, and we can put her behind bars, you'll get to go free. However, if she confesses, and you confess, then both of you will get a reduced sentence. All right? If you decide to remain silent, and she confesses, you're going to end up with 20 years, 20 years of imprisonment. If I can do anything about it, you're going to have life imprisonment. So, tell me, are you going to admit to the fact that you robbed all those banks and killed a couple of people along the way?
Will that put her in jail and he's set free?
If she doesn't confess, yes.
Yeah, I would.
You would? You're going to give her up?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Call her in. By the way, they both got the right answer because it's a dominant strategy. Given the facts that I outlined, it's a dominant strategy. They're both rational. They selected the dominant strategy. But if they had decided neither one of them to confess, and I, as the prosecutor, don't have enough evidence, I wouldn't go through that process if I had enough evidence to nail them both, right? So if I don't have enough evidence, maybe I can hang them up for a short period of time, but they're probably going to get off free if they could cooperate and trust one another. But they didn't. Yes, he did. He certainly did. He let you go. Okay, just to make sure we've got all the facts on the table. The police have caught Bonnie and Clyde. They're suspected bank robbers. There's not enough evidence to imprison. There's only enough evidence to imprison them for 1 year, but you certainly wouldn't tell them that when you're negotiating with them, right? That wouldn't make any sense to reveal that information, right? Okay, so you put them in separate rooms, as we did, and offer each of them the following deal. If you confess and implicate your partner, you go free. Both of them did just that. Okay, if you do not confess, but your partner implicates you, you get 20 years in prison. If you both confess, each gets 8 years. Okay, and that was your point, right? Okay. What's the payoff matrix look like? Okay, Bonnie has 2 choices. 1, to confess, or 2, to remain silent. Let's look at the outcomes if she decides to confess, conditional on Clyde confessing, or conditional on Clyde remaining silent. Because here, this shows the strategic interaction. You can't get the outcome unless you know what the other party will do, right? So, with regard to Bonnie, if she confesses and Clyde confesses, she ends up with 8 years. However, if she remains silent and Clyde confesses, she ends up with 20 years. And then the next 2 outcomes, condition on Clyde remaining silent, in one instance, Bonnie goes free. In the other instance, Bonnie ends up with 1 year, right? And the outcome in terms of, I call this a payoff matrix. You can call it an outcome matrix if you wish. Generally speaking, when we're talking about oligopolistic interactions among firms, we're going to be talking about monetary values. So the natural characterization would be a payoff matrix. But it's really just an outcome matrix. Okay, and with regard to Clyde, it turns out this is the outcome for Clyde if he chooses to confess versus choosing to remain silent. Now, if we go back to the definition of dominant strategy and analyze why each of Jimmy and Chenoa were entirely rational by both choosing to confess, that's in part because of the structure of the game. There is a dominant strategy, and the dominant strategy is to confess. Because let's start first with Bonnie. She's got 2 choices. She can confess. These are her 2 possible outcomes, 8 years or going free. Those 2 outcomes dominate the 2 outcomes in which she remains silent. Dominant strategy, right? And the same story, when you look at Clyde, the same outcome happens here. If we look at his 2 payoffs, he ends up, if he confesses here, and Bonnie confesses, he ends up with 8 years versus a possible outcome of 20 if he remains silent. And here, too, you get the same outcome, and there is a dominant strategy for Clyde as well. So, confessing is the dominant strategy for both players. And the Nash equilibrium is that both confess. Right? However, even though that's true, clearly the cooperative solution, if there was a real bond between the 2 of them, they could really trust one another, right? The cooperative outcome is in which they both remain silent and end up with just a year. And that's entirely analogous to our T-Mobile Horizon when you're looking at the joint monopoly profits versus their unilateral self-interest. Okay. Both confess, each gets 8 years, both would be better off. I'm just repeating what I said. The take-home message is the logic of self-interest takes over and leads each to confess. Okay? Now, taking this concept of a prisoner's dilemma and putting it into the context of firms and their interactions and what happens to them with regard to maintaining a cooperative solution in which collectively they're better off, but individually they are not better off. In our earlier example, these 2 duopolists in a small town, the cartel or collusive outcome that maximizes profits is that each firm produces a quantity of 30. And the payoff matrix for this example is as follows. And what I've done here, there are 2 possible actions with regard to T-Mobile. It can set its quantity equal to 30, or it can set its quantity equal to 40. And once again, let's ask ourselves the question, is there a dominant strategy for T-Mobile given those 2 choices? And if I look at T equals 40, regardless of what Horizon does, in one case I'll end up with profits of 1,000, in the other case 800, and those outcomes dominate the strategy of setting quantity equal to 30, right? Okay, does that make sense? And obviously they're both identical in this respect, so the same outcome happens with respect to Horizon as well. So even though if they could cooperate and trust one another and stick to the agreement, they would be both better off here with this, strike that, I'm in the wrong box, right? They would both be better off with this particular box. What happens is because of their unilateral self-interest, the equilibrium emerges in this particular box, namely both of them selecting 40, okay? Yes?
This is a situation a little different, though, because they would have to verbally, at least verbally or contractually agree to only produce 30, as opposed to actively know that they are not in contact with the other person. So isn't it easier for them to reach the quantity of 30 in the company?
So they would sign a contract? Is that an enforceable contract? It's an illegal contract. Ah, that's a key. That's a key. They could sign such a contract, but it would be illegal. And moreover, if the government or buyers of the product brought an action against them under the Clayton Act, or the government brought an action against them under the Sherman Antitrust Act, if they have such an agreement, they would have to pay whatever damages they caused by being at 30 instead of 40, or in some instances even a competitive outcome. You would measure those damages, and their liability would be 3 times that under law. So there is no such contracts. And no question about it. Yeah, but they're always... Yeah, I would prefer to interpret it the following way. Yes, you're quite right that I did set the rules. I gave the outcomes to them about what the consequences were. But here, the rules in this example are set by the marketplace. They're set by what demand is out there. And that, too, is a set of rules that they must both abide by in terms of determining what their optimal strategic interactions are. Okay. All right. So each firm's dominant strategy is to renege on the agreement and produce a quantity of 40. Okay, let's take a third active learning example. We've got 2 players here, and this, by the way, is a real-world example. The president of American Airlines, apparently they tapped his phones. And he was calling up the CEO of United Airlines and talking about agreeing not to cut fares. All right? So they nailed him. There wasn't a contractual commitment. It wasn't written. But you can go up on Google and pick it up if you're interested. And if you want to hear some real rich language, you ought to listen to Crandall when he's trying to convince the CEO of United that they should, in fact, collude and not reduce fares. Or I think actually the examples are increasing fares. Right? Anyway, he got fined a hefty sum for that telephone conversation. And it wasn't because of his language, but for the attempt to set monopoly profits in the marketplace. So here are the facts. Both cut fares. They have the choice of cutting fares by 50% or leaving fares alone. If they both cut fares, each airline's profits will be $400 million. Right? They were roughly at the same size. These facts are pretty similar to what existed historically. Not today, but historically. As you all know, American Airlines is in bankruptcy, right? Stay off American Airlines if you can. In fact, if you can, stay off United Airlines as well. Anyway, if neither airline cuts fares, each airline's profit is $600 million. If one airline cuts its fares, its profits is $800 million because it picks up all the volume, right? And the other doesn't pick up any volume. It's got much higher prices, but their profits decline dramatically. So those are the facts. Visit with your neighbors. Tell me what the answer is. Because I've given you, by the way, I've given you the outcome with regard to the entire payoff matrix, right? You don't need more information than this. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
It's regarding avoiding collusion but still playing dirty. Let's say United boosts their fares, right? And American Airlines, seeing this, knows that if they boosted their fares too, like that would be collusion, right? So they didn't talk about it. But the other option is United's going to lose their profits, so eventually they're going to have to undercut American Airlines to make that profit back up. So American Airlines now has the incentive to raise their prices to avoid United undercutting them later on. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. In fact, it's called, formally, in advanced economics, that's called conscious parallelism. Conscious parallelism. That is to say they're not colluding, but they're signaling one another. They signal, and then they suddenly and I'm going to talk about that with regard to repeated games. That's like a repeated game. These are one-shot affairs, and the analysis on a one-shot game is much different than a game that you continue to repeat again and again. Because now you can communicate without having a formal agreement. Yeah.
You're talking about the inelasticity of medicine.
Yes.
And I was thinking, and I was thinking, maybe would it be possible that the reason we don't have a cure for the common cold is because they don't have an incentive, the willingness to pay for a cure for the common cold just isn't enough for
the investment in R&D to take place. Yeah. Right. That's part of the reason. Whether it drives the outcome, I don't think there's any empirical analysis to support it. It's a reasonable hypothesis that has yet to be confirmed. Yeah. Okay, Austin, tell me what the answer is. They'll both cut their fares because they don't trust each other. I see. But it's not a question of whether they... I see. If they don't trust each other, then they're going to pursue their unilateral self-interest because they can't count on a collective interest. Is that your point? Okay, fair enough. Now, the payoff matrix in the Nash equilibrium for this game, here's the payoff matrix. And I gave you enough information to fill this out. There are 2 relevant choices for each of the 2 airlines. Cutting tariffs, don't cut tariffs. United Airlines, the same story with regard to their 2 potential actions. And we look at whether, in fact, there is a dominant strategy with regard to American Airlines. If they cut their tariffs, there are 2 possible outcomes. Either they're going to generate $400 million worth of profits or $800 million. And with regard to their strategic choice, what matters is how does that compare to the outcomes if they don't cut fares, right? Taking into account either of the 2 actions that United might take. And when we look at this, it's clear that the 2 potential outcomes, $400 million and $800 million, dominate the $200 million and $600 million. And we get the same story with respect to United Airlines, namely its 2 outcomes dominate the 2 outcomes, each of the respective outcomes for don't cut fares. So we have a Nash equilibrium in which both airlines will find it in their interest to cut fares, and they'll both end up with profits of the $400 million. Now, that doesn't deter. Any one of them would certainly prefer to have the $800 million.